You think we'll get more runes at some point? I wouldn't rule it out. I think especially keystones are a space we could open a couple of new spaces, right? And like, I don't think our current inspiration keystones are particularly good. Like, I don't actually like any of them, to be honest. Although, honestly, Spellbook, mostly what it needs is a UI redo. Spellbook is like, from a gameplay perspective, I actually like Spellbook. Mostly what I dislike about Spellbook is how like unhinged and unusable the UI is for Spellbook. But I don't really like Glacial Augment in its current form, or the original form for that matter, or First Strike either. I could see replacing those. I could see making new keystones. For example, one of the things that like is I think missing from our current system, just as one example of like keystone wise that's missing, is tanks. If they're laners, largely like solo lane tanks largely feel like they have to go grasp, which is kind of awkward. It's like not all tanks want to auto attack equally, and they don't all have the same goals throughout the game of like wanting to trade early and like scale that into like max health later, right? Like it's pretty awkward for, say, like, what's a good example of a tank? Like Maokai Top. Maokai Top was much higher synergy with something like Courage of the Colossus in the old Keystone Mastery system. That made way more sense for a Maokai Top comparatively to the runes that we have available today, which don't really work as well for him, right? Because Aftershock is a way worse rune for trading in solo lanes than Courage, right? And so, like, as an example, it's like I could build another tank keystone for solo lane tanks, and maybe that might make it so that people want to play solo lane tanks more, which might be good for the game, right? And so on and so forth, as an example. And there's, I think, other examples of like holes where keystones, like we just don't have a good keystone. We could, for example, also try to split Conqueror into 2 runes, right? Conqueror covers a lot of bases, right? And I think it doesn't necessarily have to do that. It's very, very, very broad. We could pretty reasonably split it into 2 runes and say like, hey, if you really like scaling damage over the course of a fight, this is the keystone for you. And if you really like getting a payout of Vamp if you fight champions for long enough, maybe this is the keystone for you, or whatever, right? Like something along those lines. But just generally speaking, I think there's much more space for more keystones than there are for more minor runes, if that makes sense. I think more minor rune, making another minor rune in some ways I think is actually harder than making new keystones. Because I think there's much more clear use cases for why you would want more keystones comparatively to minor runes, where you like have to come up with a purpose first, which is pretty hard when minor runes really only have like 300, 400 gold worth of power budget. It's hard to come up with stuff that's interesting and also has a real purpose, because there's not that many things you can fix with 300 to 400 gold worth of power. All right, so let me get back into talking about the Mordekaiser thing. So, let me look at the exact question. Okay, so what the game was like when something that broken existed. Something to understand is, like, first of all, number one, Mordekaiser was balanced. Like, not on the release patch. On the release patch, he was, like, very overpowered, right? But it wasn't like, oh, every single time Mordekaiser gets a dragon, he instantly wins the game. It was like, no, that's part of his power budget, right? The fact that he could get the dragon was factored into, like, part of his power budget as a champion. It was like, yes, when he gets the dragon, he's really powerful. It wasn't literally, like what you think of as like a current game power level dragon flying around. It was like, it was his own dragon, the spirit dragon with its own stats, etc. And it was very strong, right? Like it was very common to get the spirit dragon and immediately be able to transition that into a turret kill, for sure, right? Like, don't get me wrong, it was very strong, but it meant that you had to get dragon and like help kill it as Mordekaiser, which is not a trivial thing, right? Like, melee bot laners tend to be pretty bad at playing for early objectives because they have a tendency to get shoved in, right? And so Mordekaiser as a melee bot laner was not like some guy who just destroyed every game. It was like, no, he was balanced, and then he was left weak for a long time after being balanced for a while. Number one, he wasn't played that often. His play rate was very low, so you weren't that likely to encounter him. And number two, when you did encounter him, for the most part, he was generally on the weaker side, and he tended to struggle. Like, a lot of what was nerfed on him was his ability to lane. And so he tended to struggle in lane to actually get the priority he would need to rotate to dragon and actually make that play. When he did, he would then often transition that into a tower, but at the end of the day, he was still a melee bot laner and still limited by the fact that he wasn't that good at actually ending games, right? This is one of the classic problems that basically all melee bot laners have, and a lot of other champions besides, like Qiyana has this problem, for example, is like some champions just aren't good at ending the game, even if they're powerful, right? Like, I'm sure you've seen plenty of games of like, 10 kill Qiyana's losing the game, or 15 kill LeBlanc's losing the game. Mordekaiser was one of those champions where you could be personally really strong and still lose the game pretty easily because you weren't that good at ending, specifically. And the dragon was intended to help compensate for that, whereas like, oh, as Mordekaiser, the way that you're going to end the game, because you're not a ranged bot lane carry, which at the time was seen as very important to kill towers, the way you're going to end the game is by getting Dragon to do it for you. And sometimes that did work, right? That was one of the things that helped him do that. But it didn't always work, and it's like, ultimately, I think the Dragon thing was very, very cool, and I am kind of sad we didn't do at least anything like it on Mordekaiser's current kit, even though obviously it wouldn't have made that much sense, right? But it was very cool also. Ever thought of allowing T3 boots to losing team as well, just later on or maybe more expensive, like losing team can only get them at 3 legendary items, for example? I think part of the feat's design structure requires the boots to be special, so I think we wouldn't do it as you can get them later on as the losing team. We would have to do it as they must be more expensive and inefficient. And that was something that I thought heavily about in the very early days when I was changing like First Blood to Warfare, for example. That was one of the other things I considered when people were complaining a lot about feats and saying this system sucks, etc. But in general, though, I think it is nice for the feat system itself if it feels special that you get the boots and your opponents don't, and it feels like there's some actual weight to the system in that way. Now, you could argue that maybe it'd just be better to have T3 boots in the game and they're not tied to feats, and that would be like the game would be better. I think that's a reasonable argument. I don't feel super strongly that feats is like a great system. I think it's okay. It accomplishes its goals and it has some side effects that aren't, super great. But ultimately, the answer is yes, I've thought about it, but no, I haven't decided to go down the road of like actually exploring that. Like I've never tried it internally, for example, but it's something I've thought about for sure. On feats, I wish the Tabby/Mercs upgrades were more interesting, especially Mercs since the Tenacity is the main thing. I'm jealous of the mages that can buy Swifties, Sorks, Ionians. I agree. I do think that some of the boots some of the boots could be more interesting for sure. I don't particularly love the defensive boot upgrades. Like one of the upgrades I actually thought was pretty cool, but ultimately was too sharp to ship. Was the Merc? I had a Mercs upgrade where you would heal for a percentage of your health every second when you were CC'd, which I thought was pretty cool because it was like, oh, this is the tenacity item. So you buy this when your opponents have a lot of CC, then you get this upgrade, and when you get CC'd, you kind of get some value out of that, which I thought was cool. But it had some problems. Like it was really, really, really sharp, and it led to some like really, really checkmatey gameplay where it's like, oh, I'm Cho'Gath, I roll up with my heal Mercs, and you stun me, and I actually heal more from my Mercs than the damage that you dealt with to me with your, Terraki or whatever, which could feel really bad.